But if delegitimization was, as I'm suggesting, always with us, if it had its roots then in 1975 and even before, as I've sought to give you this snapshot, so the question becomes, why are we now so alarmed by it and awakening to it at this point? Is it just a matter of plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose? Or there are things, dynamics that we need to be aware of in order to appreciate why delegitimization, and I would use the more refined approach, the laundering of delegitimization under cover of law has become such an assaultive idiom in our day. Let me just, for reasons of time, just give you a series of one-liners. This is an audience that does not need any elaboration, but just a series of one-liners of the dynamics that have underpinned the development of delegitimization in the form of lawfare, and why this conference is as compelling as it is and why its theme is so warranted. First has been the advent of globalization. I don't mean only globalization in an economic sense. I don't only mean a globalization in a communication sense, the internet, the social media and the like, the whole explosion of the new media. So while the new media can transport the good, it can also become the superhighway of hate. I'm talking in particular in reference to the subject matter of the globalization of law, the globalization of rights, of the globalization of NGO and its feeding into the globalization of delegitimization. The second has been the reconfiguration of the Arab-Israeli conflict as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As my colleague, the late Justice Walter Tarnopolsky put it, that so long as the Arabs appeared to be denying Israel's existence, and that was, if you will, the original sin and that whole approach, congenital act of aggression, and as long as the Arabs were denying Israel's existence, then the Arabs had no case or even standing to make the case. But once it began to be portrayed in the reconfiguration, the Arab-Israeli conflict as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and Israel as the root cause of the conflict, so long as it then began to appear that Israel denial of the Palestinian statehood is the root cause of the conflict, then Israel appeared to have less of a case or less of a standing to make the case. And then you got the configuration, if I can borrow from the French metaphor, occupation et résistance. And so Israel was not only the occupier, but the illegal occupier, and the acts against that illegal occupier were part of legitimate resistance. But you not only had the reconfiguration of the Arab-Israeli conflict as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you had the reframing of the narrative of that new Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where Palestinianism became, as it were, the poster child for human rights. You had the mainstreaming of the Palestinian cause as a human rights cause, and you had the mainstreaming of Israel as the human rights violator within this reconfiguration of the Arab-Israeli conflict as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And you had the mainstreaming of this delegitimization amongst the elites, reminding us of the notion of Benda, la trahison des clercs, the betrayal of the intellectuals, and the politicization of academe, for which boycotts became message and metaphor, of the Palestinization of the campus culture, which the students know this only too well, as a Palestinian cause as a poster child, particularly in the campus culture, putting Jewish students, and for years now, in a kind of catch-22 pincer situation. If in a campus culture where human rights is the leitmotif, and the Palestinian cause is the leitmotif of this human rights culture, then if you align yourself and support Israel, which is the violator of human rights, you thereby distance yourself psychologically from the campus culture. And that's a difficult thing with regard to young people. On the other hand, if they embrace, as normally you would want to do, as we did as students, the campus culture with its then human rights motif for Soviet Jewry, but now the campus culture with its Palestinization, delegitimization motif, then you willy-nilly estrange yourself from Israel. And that's why I want to pay so much credit to the courage of the students today, who have the courage to stand up and be counted and move their way through this pincer movement, but stand up for Israel as a just cause. And with the advent of the human rights revolution writ large, you had the NGO revolution, with the laundering of delegitimization as a human rights case and culture, a kind of Orwellian inversion of law, morality, legality, and the like. And with the end of the Cold War, with Soviet Jewry as the motif for the human rights cause, came, as I said, the replacement by it of lawfare and delegitimization. Let me now move to the two final parts of my discussion today. The first being, what are the basic constituents of this delegitimization, this lawfare, as we now witness it and are exposed to it? And second, what is it that we can do? Again, I hope you'll indulge me in the use of abbreviated one-liners for sake of time. First, in giving you the snapshot of lawfare, the delegitimization of Israel under the cover of law, and then what can be done. Let me just identify very quickly 5 case studies of the laundering of delegitimization under the cover of law. The first is the laundering of delegitimization under the protective cover of the UN. You've heard a good deal about this in this conference, and you heard an excellent representation of this by Anne Bayevsky, and I cannot be more effective and eloquent than she was on this particular rubric. The only thing I want to mention about this is this critical mass of delegitimization under the protective cover of the UN. Every day of every year, somewhere, there's a UN agency, a UN conference, a UN resolution, a UN decision emanating from any one of these conferences, etc., that is engaged in the delegitimization of Israel. But what we sometimes forget is not only the critical mass of delegitimization under the protective cover of the UN, but the critical mass of exposure of multiple publics to this delegitimization on an ongoing basis, day after day. I can tell you, as someone who's been present either as a member of the Canadian delegation or otherwise to these various United Nations conferences or witnessed the United Nations resolutions, that what you have there present all the time are not only diplomats and parliamentarians, but media, academics, students, NGOs, and the like. In other words, a critical mass of sensibilisation, as the French would put it, where people are both exposed to and willy-nilly internalize this critical mass of delegitimization. Moreover, it has a particular impact, even if we don't yet appreciate it, even in the United States, because U.S. is a legal culture. This is a due process society. It takes law and it takes human rights seriously. These resolutions read like judgments in courts of law. In other words, they begin with alleged findings of fact and conclude with conclusions of law. And it's not fortuitous that there's been so much reference to settlements, because the reference with regard to the settlements are the reference to their illegality as propounded by UN resolutions, international law groups, and the like. In other words, it's one thing to say that the settlements are ill-advised or that the settlements are foolish, etc. It's another thing to say that the settlements are illegal, because that means that Israel is engaged in an ongoing basis in illegal acts. And that resonates in particular in a due process legal culture like the United States. So it's not just a bad policy, it is an illegal policy sanctioned under law. And I recall even the birth of this when in a conversation, again, if you'll permit me to go back to 35 years ago, conversation then with Osama el-Baz, then the senior advisor to President Sadat and became an advisor subsequently to Mubarak. Not someone who was known at the time, but with a prescient sense and laid out before me a certain strategic plan, if you want to call it, a strategic plan with regard to delegitimization. When has he put it? And there were many things said, and I wrote about it at the time, that if Prime Minister Begin keeps saying that if we have no right to Hebron, we have no right to Tel Aviv, then we will show the world that Israel has no right to Hebron, and then the world will realize that Israel has no right to Tel Aviv. And then adding in the same breath, we realize that we can get back to Sinai better with an American passport than a Soviet tank. So you begin to see the convergence of all these in terms of, as I say, this first rubric of delegitimization under the protective cover using the UN, and I've given you some case studies of the dangers of exposure.